Hello everyone, welcome to yet another day in this, the Clown Decade, the decade where things are only going to get worse before they get better, and today it's another exciting Extreme Britain Vox Pop from Politics Joe, and it's all about landlords and the housing crisis, and just to throw it out there, I am quite the landlord apologist, mainly because communists hate them, and if communists hate them, well, that's a pretty good reason to love it. So, I'll let Politics Joe go ahead and make the introductions.
A lot of industry spokespeople who don't necessarily understand the dynamics of the market think that landlords are just money grabbing.
Yeah, that's pretty true. An awful lot of people literally just think landlords are parasites or a complete drain on the economy, when in reality they're actually genuinely there providing housing. I know people say, oh, well, if landlords didn't own the housing, then we could buy the house. As if you are renting because you can afford a deposit. Come on. There's a reason absolutely every student rents, and it's because they're not planning to stay where they are forever. I bought my house because I knew I was going to stay in it for quite a long time. Before then I was renting because I knew I wasn't. Thank goodness for landlords is what I'd say.
But as tenants are feeling the squeeze, so are landlords.
I mean, yeah, it's the old meme of, hang on a minute, we wanted landlords to be the ones getting absolutely ruined by taxes. Why is our rent going up? And it's because, again, no one seems to understand how economics work. If the cost to supply something goes up, then the price is going to have to go up to compensate. And obviously, that's probably going to mean less demand as well, and they know that. And it sucks, and in reality, making things as easy as possible to buy houses, to buy to let, to build new homes, whether it's to sell to a landlord or sell to a, new family or something like that, it doesn't matter. Increasing the housing supply is obviously going to help there, and not making it as difficult as possible to be a landlord is going to make rents go down. And at the end of the day, I don't think people would care about buying their own home if the cost of rent wasn't half a standard average paycheck. And I can understand that position. But the answer isn't to absolutely ruin landlords economically. That is only going to shoot yourselves in the foot. But communists aren't going to tell you that because communists don't understand a damn thing. And again, it's just window dressing for their envious revenge fantasies.
It's a good way of making money and also making some social impact as well by providing homes for people who need them.
Once again, landlords just speaking truth. Don't get me wrong, I know there are plenty of landlord horror stories, but whenever, say, there's an investigation into, the landlords from hell, most of the time it actually turns out to be social housing. Private landlords, in my experience, as well as others that I know, private landlords are actually usually pretty good. And both tenant and landlord will give a bit of leeway to not get the law involved. I know stories of landlords being a bit slow to fix leaks, and effectively the tenants say, look, I know our smoke alarms haven't been working properly for some time, I could get the law involved in this, just get this done and fix the smoke alarm and I won't take us to court and things like that. And the landlord's pretty obliging when that happens. Now, I know that's not an ideal world, but we live in the real world, as I always say, and people are usually pretty lazy, both the landlord and the tenant, and at the end of the day, the tenants just wanted a nice place to live for their rent, and the landlord didn't want to be bothered by it. And it was no big deal in the end. And as I say, in my experience when I've been renting, the landlord's usually been pretty good at sending the handyman over whenever we've had a problem with, well, any problem you may have in the house. And trust me, that is much easier than owning a house outright. I think this is the thing with renters. They don't actually understand how irritating and annoying it is to actually own your own house compared to renting it off a landlord. Because, yeah, with the rent, you're effectively paying for the mortgage, plus other amenities, plus a profit. In the end, it might actually be better to pay that slight extra so that you don't actually have to worry about all the things, including house insurance, organising to get plumbers in, fixing all the problems that owning a home creates, and it just does create a black hole for money. But obviously the big advantage of owning a place is that, well, you have an asset that is worth an awful lot of money. So again, I can see all sides to this, but I don't think eat the landlords is a good solution to any of this. I think there is a perfectly valid place in the world for landlords. In fact, I would agree with them in that it is a good thing they exist.
Is that what got you into it?
I must admit, it was the financial element that got me into it.
Well, yeah, the financial element is what gets a lot of people into a lot of things. A big reason why I code is because there's a financial element to it. I don't think I'd ever have touched it if there weren't financial pressures. I mean, yeah, I enjoy it, I like it, but the time I spend on coding and on my job would instead, without the financial element, be used to play games, make nothing but YouTube videos and streams, and basically read. And of course, spend time with my girlfriend and all the animals we own. But there's an obvious social good to coding because, well, we're all using a computer or smartphone to listen to this video right now.
You know, and landlords, there are a lot of landlords now who are losing money every month. And nobody ever talks about them.
I don't agree with this guy. People are talking about them usually, and they are usually saying, oh my god, thank god the landlords are losing money, they're parasites, I hate them. And then these are the same people who are seeing their rent prices go up. So, again, these people are not very good at seeing cause and effect.
There are 11 million private renters in England, and if you polled them all, I'm sure they'd say that it absolutely stinks.
Kind of disappointing with this one, actually, because typically Politics Joe do actually get studies about this sort of thing and put the statistics on screen, but as you can see there, that comes from Ed's imagination. And the reason this comes from Ed's imagination is because he is a private renter, and he doesn't like it, he'd rather own his own home. That is a fine aspiration to have. My advice to Ed would be, get a better job then. And I wouldn't be shocked if he can actually save quite a lot of money by, I don't know, skipping on holidays for a couple of years. Genuinely, buying meal deals isn't actually too bad a thing, but making your own can save a bit more money. As I always say, I ended up buying my own home literally via making a lot of small sacrifices in my own life. I didn't go out as much, mainly because most of my friends moved to London while I was still up north. I rarely went on holiday. If I did go anywhere, it was usually to go down to London when there was a big internet meetup or something like that, which was a hell of a lot cheaper than going abroad, but still fairly expensive. And eventually you save up enough for a deposit, and I chose somewhere relatively cheap to live as well, because that's what I could afford. I was living within my means. And if that means renting for your whole life, then, you know, I'm sorry you live in London. But also, inviting almost 1 million immigrants a year into the country probably isn't going to do wonders for the supply and demand curves of the housing market in Britain. But you don't seem to want less immigrants here. In fact, you keep saying you want more.
A third of private renters' household income goes on rent.
Yeah, and I wouldn't actually be shocked if it's more than that for homeowners when you take into account general maintenance work, buying all the utilities that you typically already have when you are renting. I mean, when me and my girlfriend moved into our house, we didn't have anything. All we had was a sink and a shower. So we ended up having to pay like £2,000 just to get washing machine, fridge, and everything else you need that you will just get as a renter. You know, that includes bed, that includes sofa, that includes television. Luckily, my girlfriend had an awful lot of furniture that she was keeping in a self-storage place for, you know, about a year while we were looking. And family were happy to help out with second-hand things that they could give us. And, you know, my mum and dad also bought, I think, the fridge as a gift. Point being that when you buy a house, it's no cheaper than renting. At least in my experience. In fact, at least for the first year when you're having to buy all this stuff, it's probably actually a lot more expensive. And I can see it being more expensive for at least the first few years until you've actually got the house to the point where it is a home. Because, you know, we still need to decorate and things like that. This whole woe is me, isn't it terrible for renters? They just do not have the perspective of a homeowner, whether it's someone who is a landlord and renting their place out or someone who actually owns their home outright. And this is why a lot of boomers say, you know, it's not that bad and, you know, just save in other ways, because they've had to buy their own home and it ain't easy.
Rising to 41% in London.
I'm going to be honest, that's still less than I would expect. I got given pretty much the maximum mortgage that I could get off my salary, and I would probably say about half of my bills go straight on things that are directly to do with the house. Things that are covered in that a third to 41% that renters are paying on their housing. So it's actually cheaper for them compared to me, at least at the moment. So again, another reason for renting, it actually probably is cheaper than owning your own home.
That means that renters barely have enough for Adidas Sambas or OnlyFans.
My God, man, how do you think I feel? I probably also earn less than you, or my disposable income probably is less than yours, so don't start saying you can't afford OnlyFans. It's only a tenner a month, so I hear.
Private renters are 5 times more likely to experience financial hardship than homeowners.
Yes, but that's probably because mortgage brokers are pretty sure when they are checking credit history and things like that, that the people they are giving the loans to are good with their money and will actually pay their bills. I'm not shocked that people who are means tested, that they can actually pay their bills, don't get into financial hardship as much as renters. Don't try and give me this nonsense that renting is necessarily more expensive than owning a home, because I don't buy that nonsense.
and studies have shown that private renters age faster. I should know. I'm actually 13.
I'll give him that, that's a pretty good joke, but this study that he doesn't directly cite, but this is what I found on Google, said that researchers used data from UK household longitudinal study, along with additional health information and blood samples from nearly 1,500 participants. Blood samples provided information on biomarkers associated with ageing. While researchers found that renters accelerated biological ageing, there was one exception. Those whose rents were subsidised by the government did not experience faster biological ageing than homeowners whose homes had been paid off. I swear to God, if Politics Joe then uses this as an excuse to have everyone's bills subsidised, I'm going to lose my mind. The biological ages of study participants were determined at just one point in time. Further research is planned that will follow participants over time, tracking changes in their housing situation and testing for biological age. Biological aging data via blood test was only collected from white European individuals. One weakness of the study, the authors flagged. Further caveats, housing conditions may impact the aspects of their health, aside from the epigamy, and prior housing conditions may have continued impact on the epigamy even after one moves. In other words, there is a massive asterisk over this claim, and further studies need to be taken into account before we can say anything conclusive. And remembering the way I lived when I was renting before I started saving for a house, I wouldn't be shocked if my age accelerated too, given the amount of drinking and lack of exercise that I got. I mean, I was at uni, what do you expect, really?
With 4.3 million missing homes in this country, the housing crisis needs radical action from everyone.
What do you mean from everyone? What am I supposed to do? I'm not giving my home away, I've paid an awful lot of money for it.
Including landlords.
Alright, give me details on what you think they should do. And if you just say, well, they should obviously lower rent, they're not going to do that, because then they'd lose their house because they can't afford the mortgage. Well, then make mortgages cheaper. Look, none of this is going to happen because of economic reality. At the end of the day, we need to increase interest rates, lower immigration, and build more houses. They are the three main things you can do to make housing not cost half of my paycheck.
Private renting is the second largest type of home occupation in this country. So landlords house a ton of people.
Yes, and even more people own their own home outright. And for those that can't afford it or need temporary accommodation, we have landlords covering that instead. And the thing is that landlords want people in their homes, because if their homes are just left empty, then they are hemorrhaging money. So it's actually in their interest to keep the prices as low as possible, and I don't think an awful lot of renters realise that.
I want to know what they're doing to help out.
Providing you with a place to live for money. Like most things, you don't just get food for free, you have to pay for it with money.
So where you used to go to a dinner party and talk about what you did, I know a lot of landlords no longer say that they're landlords because it just gets too difficult sometimes.
Landlordism, so parasitic and so much of free money that less people are being landlords by the day. I hope all those demand-side subsidies are really doing wonders to the housing market. Oh no, wait. Why are house prices going up year on year again?
And where are your properties?
One is in Portsmouth, the other one is in Yorkshire. So one is near University of Portsmouth and the other Yorkshire we have got somewhere in South, because I haven't been there. I'm using it through letting agent.
Yeah, so this guy owns uni accommodation, and that is a lifesaver for an awful lot of students, because they are obviously going to rent. They are staying at that uni for, the majority of them for 3 years. And even then, they only really need to rent out a place for 2 years, because typically everyone, or nearly everyone in first year, will be living in student accommodation. But I don't see how any of this is you asking, what are you doing to cheapen your rents?
I've just got 2 at the moment.
Excellent. At the moment?
Yes.
Have you had more or less previously?
No, looking to do more.
Good for him. He has found a decent way to make money, and he's going to carry on. I think it's also worth pointing out that an awful lot of times people are buying these so that money isn't just staying in a savings account or staying in an ISA. They're circulating the money, investing it into a place. Typically, actually, what landlords do is they'll buy a place on the cheap that's a bit run down and then put money into it to renovate it, and then boom, you've actually got a house that wasn't livable before and now is, thanks to a landlord. And again, this is just something that renters and communists don't take into account, that actually places like this exist. I mean, when I was going around looking for a house, there were places up for about 40 grand, which is very, very cheap, but it's because there were effectively no walls in the building, the toilet didn't work. Effectively, you would have to buy it and then probably wait about 2 years for it to actually be in a livable situation. And obviously people who want to buy a house and move into it can't wait that long, and so this is why you have landlords who will put this massive investment in so that then you can have a decent long-term income from that. And I don't see why that's a bad thing.
But till the end of 2026, I wish to have at least 50, at least one BHK 50. It would be tough, I know that, but 2.5 years from today, and one of the, as I told you, I have one of my friend who has got money to invest in me.
So when he says he wants 50 households, he really means he and his friend, who I imagine is his business partner, want to own 50 places. And he clarifies later saying, oh, I want them to be small though, so I imagine it's 1-bedroom studio apartments and things like that, which are typically not too bad to afford, and typically they are not a place that you would want to buy outright, because in my experience they look quite depressing. But they're kind of there for, you know, people that they work for. I know someone, one of my friends lives in a studio apartment, and it works for them because they're out all the time anyway, and it's really just a place to go back to, do your washing, do your cooking when you can, and to sleep, and, you know, there's room for him to relax. He can just sit on his bed or lie on his bed and watch TV there or play his games there. He's fine with that. And guess what? A landlord provides that as well. There is no way he'd want to buy it, because he knows that he'd have trouble selling it after, so it works out.
I took early retirement from my corporate career, and so used the money I could get cash-free out of my pension to buy some properties. That was a mistake, because I should have used the money to mortgage them instead, then I could have had more, but there we go.
It's stuff like this that really shows the difference in perspective, because for me that's screaming really, really good business investment, really good way to make your money, keep working and make more out of your early retirement. And he's still young enough where he can be actively involved as a landlord. You know, he probably bought these places, looked round, he probably even did some of the decorating himself, and from there managed to rent them out. I think before he said he had two, and he said, oh, I should have mortgaged them, not cash bought them, because I could have had more. Again, that's his business brain on, and he didn't make the best decision he could, but he says, oh well, and carries on. And this is why an awful lot of renters say, oh, but he's just a parasite. When the thing is that if it wasn't the housing situation that he put his money into, he would have invested it in something else anyway, and he would have still called him a parasite. So just because it's in housing, I'm not going to take that as that's a bad thing or a failure. I mean, for God's sake, in the Victorian era, something like 80% of people rented. It was just normal to go around renting, owning your own furniture in the place, and having that as your assets, or you'd have your assets in a business that was in the empire somewhere. And probably part of the reason for that is because the housing crisis wasn't as bad then, because in Victorian era we could actually build things, which is what we're struggling to do today. Oh, and also there was net emigration in the Victorian era, so again, the supply and demand was not in favour of making house prices rocket up. That's what we've got in the modern day, effectively to pay for state pensions and other pension and ISA funds. Because the UK economy at the moment is effectively a housing market with an NHS tumour attached to it.
It feels like the whole environment is problematical. So the government seem to be introducing lots of anti-landlord regulation and taxation. And there's lots of pressure groups who seem to think that everything that's wrong with the private rented sector, it's all landlords' faults.
Yeah, it is absolutely the world against landlords at this point, and it's because idiots are fed up with having to pay an awful lot of money for their housing, which, again, as a homeowner, that doesn't change when you become a homeowner. Still, an awful lot of your money goes into the home. I suppose the difference is, as I said before, is that at least it's money going into an asset that you can sell later. With renting, it's obviously money you are directly paying just to live in the house. So I can understand the perspective there. However, this woman is absolutely right. There is plenty of legislation going through that is entirely subsidising demand side and not particularly helping landlords in any particular way. The most recent legislation that they're trying to put through, and I think have put through, is trying to end so-called no-fault evictions. Which all that means is that if a landlord doesn't want a contract to continue, they can just refuse to sign for the next, set number of months or years on the lease. They can just say, I don't want you in here anymore. This is when the contract ends. We agreed to this when we first signed the contract. You have till then. And they have to give at least 2 months' notice or something like that. So it's not exactly unfair, but now effectively the legislation says you have to find a good reason to get rid of them, otherwise you are forced to sign a contract to keep them on. Because I constantly say this all the time, but the Tories are left-wing, and then people give me examples. An example here is you are forcing landlords to sign a contract that they don't want to sign. Yeah, that's pretty left-wing, since it is a complete bastardization of contract law. It's the opposite of contract law. You can't have contract law if you're forced to sign something. But again, this is just a perspective where renters are like, I don't care, it's going to be great for me. Well, all this is going to mean is that there's going to be less landlords, and guess what? The renting market's therefore going to have less supply, and guess what? That means your rent goes up. You idiots.
And which pressure groups do you mean?
Charities, the likes of Shelter, and well, that's the one that springs to mind mainly, which I find odd because they don't provide any shelter. They get lots of charitable donations, but I'm not aware of them providing any shelter, but they criticise those of us who do.
So this is quite embarrassing because I used to give to Shelter monthly due to social pressure while in public and being asked, oh, you'll give to Shelter, won't you? And it's quite good that I stopped that a few years ago, because for every £1 you donate, 79p is spent directly on helping those through advice, support and campaigning. So yes, you might be right that they don't actually shelter people, it's just we'll give them advice and campaign for them. I don't want to pay for a left-wing pressure group, and then 21% is spent on fundraising. And obviously, I imagine most of that 79 pence is going towards people's salaries anyway. So it might unironically be almost a Ponzi scheme where left-wingers have, well, they either set it up or took it over and are using it effectively as a front to push, you know, it's almost like a Fabian society where they're pushing socialism quite covertly by saying, oh, people can't afford it, there's, you know, literally millions of homeless children. Clearly that means we need to stop right to buy and, you know, build a hell of a lot of social housing that Shelter will overlook, making us more money. Because it's such a shame, but it's actually not worth giving money to an awful lot of charities, because an awful lot of the money is wasted. And a lot of the money is wasted because they literally can't fail, because these types of charities will be pitched up by government subsidies and grants. You could probably call these quangos by another name, but it is effectively another arm of the socialist octopus that is all over the British government and NGOs, so that's quite interesting. And their strategies don't seem to be any better, so according to the 2021 to 2022 report, their main strategies for 2019 to 2022 were rights for renters and an end to discrimination. So in the last 2 decades, the number of households renting privately has doubled. Private renters have the highest average weekly housing costs, while having to put up with some of the worst quality housing. Our job is to stand up for private renters, we'll campaign for improvements in conditions and consumer protection, and we'll continue to use the law to fight discrimination against those on benefits. Again, just from everyone I know who's been renting, it's usually quite rare that there's anything like, you know, decrepit, terrible, mouldy places where they're living. And when it is, it's usually because they're not cleaning the place correctly. Supporting people who are struggling, we're determined to provide a service which gives the best advice to all who need it, but too often increasing need makes it difficult for us to meet demand. For that reason, we'll enhance our digital advice to cater to everyone while ensuring anyone needing emergency can speak to one of our helpline advisors, and we'll develop services in our local hubs in partnership with communities developing local vision for each. Again, we have a support helpline and you'll pay for it. Great. Building more social housing. Levels of public householding has been far too low for decades, leading to a sharp increase in homelessness and many more families stuck in expensive, poor quality, insecure, privately rented homes. We urgently need long-term, large-scale action to address the issue. We want everyone who needs social housing to get it. I would not be surprised if Shelter are actually full of NIMBYs as well, by the way, because an awful lot of left-wingers do turn out to be NIMBYs. And right-wingers too. I think it's just a British thing to be a NIMBY at this point, because everyone seems to think that Britain's a living museum. Finally, empowering communities and building a movement. Shelter was founded as a community movement over 50 years ago. Today our future lies in enabling and leading change at a community level, as well as for individuals and nationally. Our aim was to recruit thousands of supporters who help us defend the right to a safe home, harnessing the power of change found in our services, shops, campaigners, donors, and partners, and use it to empower and amplify the voice of anyone who wants to work alongside us. The national emergency will not be stopped by anything less than the national movement. So this is kind of annoying. It turns out that their whole strategy is just have a helpline and pressure the government into forcing landlords to continue contracts they don't want to continue and getting them to write out and sign contracts with people that they don't even want living in their house because they frankly don't think that they'll pay the bills. And when I was giving money to Shelter, I assumed that they ran homeless shelters. You'd think a place called Shelter would run shelters, but no, they don't. They don't even do that. This woman's completely correct. Shelter don't even home anyone. They are a glorified helpline, which I wouldn't have a problem with if that's what they made clear they were doing, but when I gave them money, all I was told is they help people with homelessness who are at risk of being homeless. I assumed that meant that they put them into homeless shelters, privately charitable run ones. No, apparently not. Apparently it's just we help them by giving them advice. Well, la-di-da, everyone has the internet these days.
Is it about this market that's appealing?
Well, there's essentially a recession. This is a time of change, and when you get change, so for example in the 70s suddenly divorces became big. That means that people needed 2 different places to live in instead of 1, so you had a lot of subdividing of accommodation. That's what we're seeing now. We've got a shortage of accommodation here, and particularly with the rise of HMOs and so forth. It's how you subdivide a family house into 5 units for young professionals and create more units, so that's it really. It's a time of opportunity.
Yeah, the man's pointing out something that's completely true. There are a lot of homes that are housing multiple occupants. I think the most common way to live in London at the moment is, it might be in London, it might just be for under 35s, is actually living with flat or housemates, with like 2 others, I think it is. So a 3-person house, but it's being shared by, 3 office workers or something like that. Effectively, the uni home situation is lasting until people are 35. And the thing is that actually was normal. I think my parents moved in together when they were 24, and both of them did the same thing. They were in multiple housing units, but obviously the thing is that they did it 10 years earlier than people are doing it now. But the other thing is that people are getting married later. People are effectively expanding their 20s until they're in their mid-30s. Both my brother and sister have done that. And it shouldn't be surprising that the housing situation is reflecting that. And don't get me wrong, I understand all the economic factors that are effectively making that the best way to live for an awful lot of people until they're 35. But again, that was mainly in London. And it's probably true in other big cities as well. But you go outside that, and people are affording their own homes and affording to live either by themselves or with their partner. I've said it before in videos like this, but literally all of my friends either own their own property outright or own it with their partner. Obviously, I own mine with my partner, some of my friends own it with their partner, and some of the others own their own flats and small homes, and it costs a fair amount, but so does renting, and we all realised, well, if we all just hang about and save up for a few years, we'll end up being able to afford them, and guess what? We do. It's not my fault you're not very good at saving, Ed.
One of the speakers said today that we shouldn't call ourselves landlords because that sounds a bit feudal. We should say we're housing providers because that sounds more like what we actually do.
Yeah, it's certainly true in the modern day that language is almost a huge part of marketing when it comes to your own political group, and this was a big thing that came out of a Tory policy forum that I went to a couple of years ago now, I think, and it was about capitalism. And one of the big takeaways that the Tory party saw was stop calling it capitalism because that's become a bit of a meme that people hate. Call it the free market or something like that because free sounds good and it's a lot more marketable. When people say capitalism, they think things that aren't capitalist, like the world we live in today. And it's also still an accurate term, and housing providers would also be an accurate term. I mean, they're not providing it for free, but, supermarkets aren't providing food for free. They're still food providers.
And I think the government should recognise that and make its legislation to facilitate people continuing as landlords and or as housing providers and becoming new ones rather than driving people out of the industry, which is what's happening at the moment.
And another point he should make there is that if you have more landlords, rent will drop in price. Due to basic supply and demand. You need to keep making that point as well. The less landlords you have, the higher your rent's going to be.
It's hard to as a sector to be constantly criticised for trying to do the right thing, when a lot of the stories that are sensationalised on the news are really the very bad landlords, and they really are in the minority. So it feels like all the good landlords are being hit to counter the rogue landlords, who should be dealt with anyway. There's enough legislation and regulation out there for them to be dealt with as it is. So.
And that feels true in an awful lot of walks of life. It appears that the government would rather keep creating new legislation that is effectively just reworded old legislation, and then they don't even properly enforce that law anyway. The issue isn't that we don't have enough legislation and laws, the issue is that they're not being enforced properly. And yeah, being a landlord who is making a squalid dwelling, as I say, if the tenants report them to the police, yeah, they can actually get into legal trouble for that, because it is already law to not have squalid conditions for your renters. Which, you know, ANCAPs would say, well, under market conditions, that would all work itself out anyway. And you know what, that's probably true. But I still think it's fine to have legislation that says, as a landlord, you can't have your tenants have a leaky bathroom and do nothing about it. I think that's fair enough legislation.
And then your house where you live, do you rent that?
Yeah, I'm living as a rent for now.
So there's an interesting dynamic. You're a landlord, but you rent. How do you get on with your landlord? What's your assessment of them?
Oh, they're nice. Like, they don't bother me, and it was like my sister's. The sister has rented it out, so she's renting 2-bedroom hall. So I'm in 1 bed. So she's dealing with that, and we are paying on time. So otherwise they're good. We had some problems in meanwhile, like windows problem, too much drought. So they changed it. Mold problem. It started in bathroom, but they fixed it, and so yeah. Otherwise, landlords, if you're paying on time, they don't mind helping us as well. So that was good for us. Yeah.
It's almost like Ed's in shock that this guy's renting while renting out other properties. I mean, the thing is that given that his own 2 properties are at other sides of England, you know, in Yorkshire in the north and in Portsmouth in the south, I wouldn't be surprised if he actually hops where he lives quite consistently, because clearly he doesn't stay in one place at one time, and so therefore he rents. And he says, yeah, my landlord's fine, I pay my bills on time, and then he fixes windows that are too drafty and fixes mould problems because he knows there's an economic interest to do that. And because I'm a good tenant, he is happy to fix these issues for me. But that actually seems to be the experience of an awful lot of people who rent. But obviously, you don't get these as news stories because this is the norm. You get news stories of terrible landlords because they are the exception. Hence, they make the news.
Lots of people are talking about challenges within the industry, like the introduction of the Rent Reform Bill or the abolition of Section 21. How do you feel about things like that?
I think that, funnily enough, from what I've heard at the event today, I think I agree with the speakers who said that let's hope that the Tories get the Rental Reform Act done ASAP, because if they lose the election and it's left to Labour, we reckon it'll be a lot harder on us. So there we go.
To be honest, that's true for an awful lot of sectors within the UK. But the problem is that if Labour, well, when Labour get in anyway, they'll make it worse anyway. As I say, we live effectively in a socialist country where people are gaslit into thinking it's the most capitalist country in the world, simply because some people are rich in it. When in reality, these billionaires and whatever, they're constantly saying about how they're struggling to keep the business going and keep it actually profitable because they keep having to increase the prices because of all the legislation in place that makes it difficult to keep things cheap. But all these socialists just think, get rid of the businesses, get rid of the landlords, and everything will be hunky-dory. Well, I wouldn't be shocked if the amount of people leaving Britain to go to Australia increases exponentially over the next 5 years or so, thanks to Labour ruining the country even further.
But I think that I don't think it's that much of an issue, and I think that what gives tenants better protection is not a bad thing.
I mean, fair enough, this is this guy's perspective, and I imagine he is fine with this legislation because the main issue with removing Section 21 is that that's the no-fault eviction thing where you have to keep extending the lease until you have a good reason to let them go or they want to go themselves. And I wouldn't be surprised if this guy's got very, very good tenants who he wants to keep on as long as possible anyway. So effectively this legislation isn't really going to affect him, therefore he's not got much of an opinion on it, and realises that Politics Joe is quite pro-tenant, anti-landlord, so he's probably trying to get on the good side there. That's what I'd imagine is going on there.
Well, I think if you were if you were ever thinking of being in the property business long term, you should always have been thinking about the end result, inheritance, and also what is the corporate structure, how is that going to work, in the long run. And basically, they've ended up, not through necessarily fault of their own, but, because they haven't done that, they've ended up being caught short by this. Had they set up a limited company, then it wouldn't be happening, would it? So, I don't know. Do I have any sympathy? No.
I mean, fair enough. It's a bit I'm all right, Jack, that response. But yeah, private landlords that end up owning their property through a business aren't being as pounded by this legislation as landlords that are completely private and own the property in their own name. So yeah, effectively, this guy said, well, you should have seen this coming, so it's kind of your own fault that you have to deal with the consequences now. And this basically means that he's also got an advantage in the market now, because obviously he's not going to be as affected by this new legislation, so his profit margins are probably going to be up as well. And so he's actually probably quite happy with this legislation, which, from someone who's quite a free market fundamentalist, yeah, I don't see why you should have an advantage setting yourself up as a limited company and then owning the property to rent, rather than just renting it in your own name. I don't see a good reason that should ever be legislation that affects that sort of thing.
No, not really, because they could have taken advice and then they'd been advised not to do that. So, and I think they probably did slightly better over those years, so it was just a bit of greed.
Kind of annoying he's saying that, where now he is going to be making more money. Like, couldn't they just say you're being greedy because you want this to happen? Everyone's acting in their own self-interest, and in economic terms, yes, they had it better off, and now they don't. You had the foresight and the advisors to let you know that this is probably coming down the line, so get ready to deal with it in advance. And well done, now you're making more money. Isn't that just greedy as well?
It's a bit like if you go to, somewhere in the Middle East because you don't want to pay tax and you get kidnapped. Whose fault's that?
Guy's not wrong in the end, though, is he? If it was on the horizon that something would like this to private landlords rather than companies acting as landlords, then yeah, they absolutely should have done something about it. You're absolutely right. However, on the other hand, it's a point of principle that why should the private company get advantages that individuals don't? Doesn't make sense.
Now, I'm in a network of really professional landlords, and there's quite a few of us, in fact quite a lot of females, and I know that a lot of them feel in despair at the minute because their costs have gone up, their mortgage and finance costs have gone up. Not every landlord has a mortgage, but most people do. And so I think that a lot of industry spokespeople who don't necessarily understand the dynamics of the market think that landlords are just money grabbing.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it is a business being a landlord, and if there is major struggle with that, then obviously being a landlord becomes less tenable. Okay, tenants say, yay, there's less landlords, I hate landlords. I mean, even tenants is the wrong thing to say. Communists will be, yay, there's less landlords, and then they'll see their rents go up. It's exactly the tweet. Me reaping, oh yeah, this is great. Me sowing, what the hell, this isn't what I wanted at all, this sucks. The exact same thing's going to happen.
But as tenants are feeling the squeeze, so are landlords. And the problem is, because it's a business situation, if your cost base is higher than your level of income, it means that they're going to go bust. And so ultimately, that tenant is going to be out of the home and they're going to be homeless.
Yep, and all the comments in this video are basically saying, oh, landlords are just parasites, screw them, I don't want them to have money. Okay, you're very welcome to have that position. Well, enjoy not having a more affordable home. Instead, having to live with your parents until you're 40 and can actually afford the deposit to own your own home. As far as I'm concerned, they get what they deserve. If I was a tenant, obviously, I'd be a lot more annoyed about this, but I own my own home now, so I'm all right, Jack.
So it is a very difficult situation. So I'm not sure the amount of regulation there is necessary.
Yep, it's just a general rule for me now. Everything needs to be deregulated. There's too much regulation everywhere. If there is a market that isn't regulated enough, I haven't heard of it. But do put your ideas of what may be under-regulated in the comments, and I will see how it is.
As in every industry, there are rogues, but the majority of landlords, I think they said that the statistics are that 85% of landlords have 1 to 3 properties.
And it explains how this is typically got through inheritance or via a couple, moving in together, and then they have 2 houses, and so the second one they just rent out. Yeah, all makes perfect sense. However, obviously, the ideal for these socialists will be, oh, well, why can't they just sell that house or give it away for free? I imagine would be another thing they say. And, well, the answer is because they're probably still paying a mortgage off that, so it just makes sense to rent it out. so that they can make a bit of money off it while also paying off the rest of the mortgage so they have an asset there to sell off when they own it outright. And that's absolutely fine for them to do. I don't know why so many people are against that sort of, savvy businessmanship. Oh, but shelter is a need. Yes, they know. That's why they're selling it to you. The service of living in that home and not having to worry about all the extra things you have to do when you outright own the home. In fact, they have to do that twice because they own 2 properties. And actually the second one, basically a total stranger's living in there and they're trusting them not to trash up the place.
Helping other people get to have a roof over their head when they can't afford to get onto the housing ladder, I think it's not a bad thing.
Yeah, it's a perfectly reasonable thing, but they can't help but think, oh, if they own a house, that means it's a house that's off the market that I could afford, when they can't afford any of them. Honestly, it's a ridiculous take.
If we want to have good housing stock, we need to be increasing supply for all types of housing, and we need to be encouraging landlords back into the sector, particularly in the private rental sector, because that is the biggest sector at the moment who are providing homes for those who can't afford to buy.
Well, that second part is a bit of a niche for landlordism, sure, but the first part's absolutely right. We do need to increase the supply. And also she doesn't mention about the decrease the demand, but, they're not really talking about immigration in this conversation. And she probably doesn't want to open that can of worms either, so whatever. It's not bad advice is what I'll say.
There's a housing crisis in the country at the moment, and a lot of tenants are going to be facing the brunt of that as a cost for the landlord rise.
Yeah.
The rent increases, and people's wages aren't necessarily going up. Do you have empathy for tenants in that situation?
Yeah, I do. And I think also that landlords are getting the short end of the stick there a lot because quite honestly, we're trying to make more units available. That's what we do. We don't just make money. We try and provide nice homes for people, and we try and provide more homes for people. There are a lot of government initiatives which we're following now to help get more properties available to tenants.
He did a really good thing of flipping that question on its head. Oh, do you have sympathy for tenants in that this is going to cost them more money? And he instantly just flips it on its head and says, well, yeah, but the landlords are getting the short end of the stick because they have to deal with all the costs of this, and obviously that gets passed on to the tenants, and we actually want to help the tenants and give the tenants a good service so it's worth their money, because tenants will say, oh, my landlord didn't get my boiler fixed for like 3 days and it was the worst thing ever. Oh, that's terrible. My boiler went out over Christmas and we lost it for about 3 weeks. It's simply put because we weren't prepared, and tenants don't even think about this sort of thing. This thing's just done for them, and they honestly just take it for granted. So, honestly, it's a wake-up call when you buy your own home. I used to be a bit more tenant-sided. Now I'm basically entirely landlord-sided. Aside from the rogue ones, get rid of all the rogue ones and it'll be fine. No one would have any complaints. Well, actually, they still would because they're socialists, but, you get what I mean.
Because, they're in a real-life situation and they maybe have difficulty in paying the rent and all that sort of stuff. It's a recession. Everybody's got their difficulties as well. So, and landlords, there are a lot of landlords now who are losing money every month. And nobody ever talks about them. Not obviously, everyone assumes they're rich, don't they? Oh, no, they're the 1%. No, they're not. And, they're just regular people who foolishly bought a house when interest rates were low without doing any research.
Yeah, this guy's kind of right on that level. Interest rates aren't going to stay low forever. And you might see less landlordism if interest rates go up. It'll make demand for housing go down, that's for one thing, because, the mortgage rates all of a sudden go up because it's 5% instead of 2% or whatever. But again, that was the historical norm. Most of the boomers who bought their houses for, a packet of chips or something like that, that was at a 5% rate. But again, there were less people then, and there wasn't a ridiculous short supply of housing. And there also wasn't mass immigration, I think I should point out as well. So people who bought houses could afford them, and they were also a lot cheaper, obviously. And even then they were cheaper because generally there probably wouldn't be central heating in an awful lot of them. Insulation wouldn't have been anywhere near as good as it is now. There would have been loads of downsides with technology that we've made over the past 50 years that wouldn't have been in there. And now it's all more efficient and more expensive because of that as well, and nobody seems to think of that either. What's this all provided by? To tenants? Landlords.
Obviously there's a housing crisis in the UK at the moment. Do you think landlords kind of have a duty to alleviate that?
No, I think that the government has a duty to alleviate that by facilitating new home builds and by having legislation that doesn't force landlords out of the private rental sector, which is what has been happening as a result of the latest legislation.
I mean, I'd love to ask Ed what he thinks landlords should do, because I do not understand what he thinks they should do. He's being told by every landlord here, loads of them are losing money. You know, we know loads of people here who are here today saying, don't have this legislation in, I'm already on a shoestring budget with providing the housing for the tenants, and this isn't going to help in any way. In fact, it's going to make it more difficult. So if an awful lot are finding it very, very difficult, and an awful lot are effectively just middle-class people who either inherited a house, decided to put their savings into a new house or whatever, then what do you expect them to do? As this guy says, it's the government's job to lower immigration, it's the Bank of England's job to stop having ridiculously low interest rates, when that's clearly causing a load of problems, and yes, build more houses, not necessarily new builds because they look garbage, but get rid of the Town and Country Planning Act that makes it basically impossible to even make a dog park in a field. That was one of the most latest NIMBY wins. A dog park on grass in a field was declined by a local council somewhere in the south. Like, this is also an issue with landlords. They also have the restricted housing supply, hence the price for mortgages goes up as well. Like, clearly we need to build houses, yes, even if we didn't have mass migration for the last 20 years.
Personally speaking, me always been working with charities in India as well. If you can let go few of the rents, like say, if you're earning 20% rather than 30%, you should try and do that. It would helping someone in 10% would be life-saving for someone else. Like, it would be a month's salary for somebody.
I'm not going to lie to you, I don't know any landlord that is working on a 30% profit margin. And if they are, then yes, obviously they can slim down that margin. But the thing is that if the market is saying, actually, you can put these prices up, there is too much demand, then they should keep it that way. Otherwise, there's just going to be massive queues for people to rent instead. So no, I don't think the solution is necessarily to lower their price, though obviously I think they should do that to reflect the market situation. And to be honest, they'll be forced into that anyway. But no, the market is saying there's not an awful lot of supply, an awful lot of demand. Supply is actually going to go down because there'll be less landlords, and therefore obviously the prices are going to go up. So yeah, what can landlords do? Lower their prices a bit. Okay, maybe, but maybe the market's forcing them into another direction instead. Maybe they're not working on 30% profit margins. So maybe they can't afford that then to keep their business going. Anyway, that was Landlords, making a hell of a lot more sense than any communist I've heard in the last 10 years, so there you go, that's your video for today. The Other Side of the Hill will be returning tomorrow, Regional Variations will be on Wednesday, and then Sunday evening I will be having a talk with Alfred the Invincible. If you take a look on my Twitter Sunday evening, I will be sharing it out there, so catch me there. Anyway, that's everything I had for you today, so once again, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.